Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trainer Circle webinar. My name is Katie Hallis, and I'm a nutritionist with the Nutrition Education, Training, and Technical Assistance Division in the Child Nutrition Programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service. So thank you all for being with us today, Today's webinar will focus on training program operators to use grains ounce equivalents. And this webinar is part of Team Nutrition's Child and Adult Care Food Program Trainer Circle webinars. These interactive webinars for the CACFP focus on tactics and techniques that trainers can use to empower program operators with the knowledge and skills needed to provide high-quality meals and snacks in the CACFP. These webinars aim to assist state agencies, CACFP sponsoring organizations, and independent centers in planning and implementing quality job skills training for CACFP operators. I do want to let you know that we have 4 recorded webinars available on our Team Nutrition website already, including one on coaching and mentoring using a peer-to-peer model, creative online learning strategies to engage providers, delivering interactive in-person trainings, and one on our CACFP Trainers Tools Feeding Infants Kit. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available at a later date on the Team Nutrition website. And we will have time at the end of this webinar to take questions, but you can use the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your or side of your screen at any time during the webinar to enter those questions. And we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. And lastly, I do want to mention that you should have received a list of resources in your registration, confirmation, and reminder emails. Please pull that up. Please have that handy as we go through today's presentation. You'll notice throughout this webinar that the speakers will refer to that list quite often. Okay, before we get started, I do have a couple polling questions for you. And first, we just want to get to know you. We want to know who you are. So please go ahead and select one of the following listed on the poll. Let us know if you are state agency staff who plan and implement CACFP training. Are you government agency staff who develop training material? Are you community-based organization staff who plan and implement CACFP training? Are you CACFP organization staff who provides training? Are you a CACFP site operator who attends training and may train other staff, or other? So go ahead and click on an answer in the poll on the side of your screen, and don't forget to click submit at the bottom. But if you're unable to select or submit an answer, you can also just go ahead and use that chat box. Also, if you select other, please go ahead and tell us who you are in the chat box if your role is not listed already. So go ahead and do that now. And if for some reason the polling question box needs to be moved anywhere on your screen, you can go ahead and click the box and hold down and drag it to where you want. All right, I'm going to give you all a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, let's see who's with us today. All right, great. I see a lot of sponsoring organization staff and CACFP site operators. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. So to set the stage for today's webinar, I want to give you all a very important reminder that by October 1st of 2021, so October 1st of this year, amounts of grains at CACFP meals and snacks will be credited using a unit of measure known as ounce equivalent. And our speakers will also mention this too in just a little bit. So what does that mean? Well, 1 ounce equivalent of a grain item contains 16 grams of grains. For example, 0.8 ounces of savory crackers, such as cheese crackers that are shown on the screen here, contain 16 grams of grains. So we would say that you need 0.8 ounces of savory crackers to make up 1 ounce equivalent of grains. For another example, 1 ounce of toasted O's cereal contains 16 grams of grains. So 1 ounce of this cereal equals 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And then our last example here is a 2-ounce blueberry muffin, which usually contains 16 grams of grains. So a 2-ounce muffin is equal to 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Because most food packages do not list how many grams of grains are in one portion of the food, Team Nutrition has created several resources that show how many ounce equivalents of grains are common in grain items, such as bread, crackers, tortillas, cereals, and much more. And you're in luck because today's webinar will focus on all of those training tools as well as tactics and techniques that can be used to help CACFP operators get ready to use grains ounce equivalents by October 1st, 2021. Okay, so let's talk about our learning objectives for today. After this webinar, you will be able to identify at least 3 resources that are available on ounce equivalents for grains in the Child and Adult Care Food Program. You'll also be able to determine the benefits and drawbacks of in-person and virtual learning, and determine at least 2 resources and training methods that best suit the needs of your target audience. Okay, here's another polling question for you all. So if you haven't conducted or trained CACFP operators on ounce equivalents for grains yet, when do you plan to conduct your first training? Please go ahead and select one of the following. Do you plan on providing that training this month in February, or March, April, May, June, July, August, or September of this year? So go ahead and click on an answer in the poll on the side of your screen. And again, don't forget to click submit. If for some reason the poll feature isn't working for you, please go ahead and enter your answer into the chat box. Okay, I'm going to give you all a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's close that poll and see those answers. All right, so it looks like you guys are all planning, it's pretty equally dispersed between February and September of this year. So thank you for taking the time to answer that question. All right, so it's great to get to know those of you that are on the webinar with us today. And now I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. So on the webinar with us, we have Shirley Wu and Mimi Wu. Shirley is going to be our first speaker. She is a child nutrition specialist with the Oregon Department of Education. And our second speaker is Mimi Wu. Mimi is a nutritionist with the Nutrition Education Training and Technical Assistance Division in Child Nutrition Programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service. So welcome, Shirley and Mimi. I'll now turn it over to Shirley to talk about how they are training CACFP operators in Oregon.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Shirley Wu, and I am a child nutrition specialist with the Oregon Department of Education, also known as ODE. I work on the community team at ODE, which work with the Child and Adult Care Food Program and the Summer Food Service Program. In the past 3 years, I have also been the coordinator for CACFP meal pattern trainings in Oregon. So today, I will be sharing Oregon's evolving trainings on ounce equivalents for grains. We have trained on ounce equivalents several times, and we're able to learn and adapt from each iteration of our training. I will take you through a high-level view of our process today so you can learn about some of the benefits and drawbacks of different training platforms, learn about some of the resources that we used, and take away some lessons learned on training ounce equivalents for grains. Quick note here, even though ounce equivalents can also be used for the meat and meat alternate component, anytime I say ounce equivalents during this webinar, it will be referencing ounce equivalents for the grains component. Before I dive into our ounce equivalents training, I wanted to get a feel of the audience's familiarity with this topic. So the poll has been launched, and thank you. The poll asks, how comfortable are you with providing training on ounce equivalents in the grains component at this time? Are you very comfortable with it, moderately comfortable, only mildly comfortable, or not comfortable with it at all? And it is okay if you are not comfortable with it all too. There's no right answer here. And I'm going to give you just a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's close the poll. And it looks like a good majority of you are not comfortable or only mildly comfortable with ounce equivalents right now, and that's okay. Hopefully I can provide you with more information on how to best use the available resources that are out there and map out a rough plan for training your staff or CACFP operators. Let's talk about ODE's ounce equivalent trainings. ODE was able to provide a wide variety of CACFP meal pattern trainings due to the fiscal year 2018 CACFP Meal Service Training Grant, and ounce equivalence was a cornerstone of our mandatory in-person trainings in 2019. Our in-person trainings provided the groundwork for webinar-based trainings that came after. The in-person training was mandatory for all sponsoring organizations and independent centers in Oregon on the CACFP. And our goal was to make sure that all of them were set up for success by October 1st, 2019, which was the original implementation date. We had some challenges during this time, which some of you may be able to relate to. The first was that ounce equivalence was pretty new to quite a few on our team. During that time, we were starting to develop this training in late 2018. Many of us were with about 25% of you that were feeling not comfortable at all with training other people on ounce equivalents. So we needed to get our team trained and fully versed in what ounce equivalents meant for the CACFP operators in our state. In addition to that, our next challenge was that many of our CACFP operators had not operated the National School Lunch Program, which had already incorporated ounce equivalents into their grains components, and so they would not have a good base of understanding. We had to start from the basics. Finally, the last challenge was that, like our NBA team, we needed to be trailblazers. We had asked around, and there had not been many trainings provided by other state agencies, and so we had to start from scratch. With all of that in mind, we planned for multiple in-person trainings all around the state. With all trainings, it's important to keep in mind the amount of time you need to roll out the training effectively. This is especially true with in-person trainings where there is a lot of groundwork to set up. The first step was to decide on the topics for training. Once the topics were set, we needed to develop a curriculum and create handouts. At the time, no ounce equivalence handouts were available, so we set about creating our own. In January 2019, with an initial draft of our curriculum, we trained all of our staff, bringing them up to at least moderately comfortable with ounce equivalents. Also in January, we started our recruitment plan by sending out save the date flyers and then opened registration in February of 2019. Prior to our trainings, we continued to revise materials, but had to finalize all changes in time for our print deadlines in March 2019. We had 10 in-person trainings throughout Oregon and had about 4 to 5 staff at each training. We had 3 presenters, and at most trainings, additional staff helped with administrative functions, such as signing attendees in, providing help with picking up all handouts and supplies, and collecting questions. Altogether, we trained 379 people. Each of these trainings were 4.5 hours long, and the ounce equivalent section took 1 hour. After the trainings were completed, we took all return surveys and reviewed the feedback provided. From this, we were able to revise our training for the makeup webinar that we set up for August of that year. I will go over some of the feedback that we received a little later on. We then took feedback received from our August 2019 webinar and prepared for our 2020 webinar based on all surveys received. From beginning to end, you can see that our training spanned a full year with about a lead time of 7 months to get our in-person trainings ready to go. Our 1-hour session on ounce equivalents was divided into 2 sections with about 30 minutes allotted for each section. The first part is instructional. This was important to set the groundwork for understanding. Since many of our attendees were new to ounce equivalents, we wanted to make sure they understood the basis and definition of ounce equivalents. The second part was more hands-on. We provided examples of different grain products, and based on what they learned and the materials that were provided, they were expected to work in teams to figure out the ounce equivalent serving size for each product that was assigned. From previous in-person training experiences, our team knew that some attendees would be more administrative and would have less experience with the meal pattern. By working in teams, this allowed attendees to have more support from their peers. In the case of ounce equivalents, we also knew that school district staff who were more familiar with ounce equivalents would be attending as well, and they were able to help some of our other attendees better understand the process. We provided paper surveys to all attendees and got feedback from them. Here are some lessons learned that draws from those feedback and our personal experiences. First, the benefits of in-person trainings. Like many of you, we enjoy seeing our CACFP operators during trainings, and many sponsoring organizations enjoy the opportunity to learn from others in the state. It's a great time to make connections and ask questions in person. We find that a greater variety of questions come up with in-person trainings. This type of training also allows for more hands-on activities with immediate implementation of learned skills. What we also have found is that with the training fresh in their mind, we were able to get more detailed feedback. And as you will see, the feedback was very valuable in helping us refine our training. There are some drawbacks of in-person training, though, mostly related to resource management. This type of training is intensive and can be very expensive due to all the staff time and travel costs. The planning involved requires a longer timeline. In our case, it was about 7 months. And with so many staff involved, you need to make sure that all trainers are at least on the moderately comfortable to very comfortable stage prior to game day. Overall, though, despite the administrative drawbacks, we do find that in-person trainings are effective. Based on the surveys that were turned in, attendees reported greater understanding of all CACFP meal pattern topics after the training. We had specific questions about ounce equivalents, and we asked how prepared they felt for ounce equivalents at the end of the training. 76% said yes, they felt prepared, while 11% said no, and 13% did not provide an answer. This was an indication that at least a good majority of our attendees felt that the training provided them with the knowledge they needed for ounce equivalents. What we found most illuminating, however, was the open comments. Most comments were very positive. However, we did have comments wishing we had less handouts, that the definitions provided on ounce equivalents were confusing, that the process was complicated, and because of that complication, there just was not enough time to go over all of the examples within the time frame we provided. Ultimately, there were some that still did not understand why we were moving to ounce equivalents at all. So from this, we had a main takeaway. We needed to simplify our procedures, simplify the explanations and examples, and clarify the purpose of ounce equivalents. And we set out to do exactly that with our second chance training. This was a second chance for our CACFP operators to take their annual training, but it was also a second chance for us to get ounce equivalents right. We already knew by June and July of 2019 that we didn't have the resources to continue with in-person training the next year. And so in our adaptation to our makeup webinar, we also wanted to incorporate our takeaways of simplicity and clarity. At the time, ODE used GoToWebinar as our virtual platform. The makeup webinar was a live webinar that ran for 3 hours, and included time for questions and answers at the end of each section. Of the 3 hours, about 40 minutes was devoted to ounce equivalents. Registration, polling, and surveys were integrated within the platform, which was convenient since I could pull all reports directly from it. This time we were more targeted in our recruitment, focusing on CACFP organizations who had not completed the required trainings. We did open it up as an additional training opportunity for all independent centers and sponsoring organizations, and we ended up with 67 attendees. And here are the main changes that we had to our ounce equivalent training for our webinar. The format change from in-person to live webinar meant that we were not able to have hands-on team practice, and instead we changed to interactive polls to keep attendees engaged. Because it is hard to schedule in breaks for webinars, we decided to keep the length at 3 hours. This still ultimately was a little long for a live webinar, and we learned to keep all live webinars at 1 hour maximum when possible. In terms of the specifics of ounce equivalent training, we ended up clarifying the definition of ounce equivalent and using a comparison to the meat and meat alternate components use of ounce equivalents to try and draw a connection to a more familiar concept. Most CACFP operators were very familiar with crediting ounce equivalents for meat and poultry, and this helped to connect that link. We also reduced the number of examples that were provided. For our in-person trainings, we wanted to cover different scenarios, but what we found is that with introductory trainings, it's more important to have a solid base of understanding of that core concept. Reducing examples and focusing on examples that are easy to understand help to solidify the main concept and empower the attendees to apply that concept later on. We also listened to our feedback and cut back on the number of handouts that we had. It was confusing to go from handout to handout, and some attendees had been frustrated trying to find a piece of information within a huge stack of papers. So we cut information to the basics and consolidated 2 worksheets into one that we call the product specification sheet for grains, which could also be used outside of trainings to help CACFP operators organize their grain products. Finally, the biggest change was in shifting the focus from calculating the amount of grains ounce equivalent in a portion of food to a decision on whether or not the portion served met the minimum amount of grains required instead. This was a subtle shift, but it allowed the focus to move away from calculations and math, which many attendees found intimidating, to a yes or no question. Did the portion size meet minimum ounce equivalent requirements for the age group? Yes or no? Some calculations were still needed, but it reframed it to an understandable concept that CACFP operators do all the time. Are the foods that you serve meeting portion size requirements for CACFP? From our surveys, attendees of the webinar felt more confident with ounce equivalents after the webinar. In the survey question on whether the attendee felt prepared for ounce equivalents, this time we saw a jump to 90% feeling prepared instead of 76% from the in-person trainings. Without having in-person immediate feedback, a lot of the open comments were shorter, and many surveys didn't have the open comments filled out at all. General comments were very positive, but we did see feedback requesting additional resources for ounce equivalents. From the feedback that we got, we knew that we were headed in the right direction, but there were still many operators who were not confident about ounce equivalents, and there still needed to be more resources to guide them. So in preparing for our 2020 live webinar, we knew that many large CACFP operators, such as school districts and Head Starts, planned menus and procured items with about a half-year lead time. And so the webinar would represent one of the last opportunities to communicate with them prior to implementing ounce equivalents in CACFP. We also knew that many CACFP operators did not feel confident in their understanding of ounce equivalents, and so we wanted to provide supplemental resources that could be referenced anytime by anyone. We also wanted to use this opportunity to reduce any concerns operators had with this shift. With our lessons learned about long webinars, we sought to create and present a 1-hour-long webinar solely on ounce equivalents. We were all extremely excited that Team Nutrition had released a series of great ounce equivalent resources, which you will see later on. From our prior experience, we knew that we did not have enough time to go over all the worksheets that were available, and instead we needed to pick one that would be the most helpful and contain tools that made the switch to ounce equivalents as easy as possible. Our timeline was much shorter thanks to the virtual platform and the additional resources. While we had to change our webinar dates due to COVID, we were able to open registration 2 months prior to the webinar, develop the presentation, and gather all resources during that same 2-month period. We presented on GoToWebinar in August of 2020 to an audience of 48 attendees, which was about an average number for our live webinars. Like before, our ounce equivalent training focused on definitions and understanding. I bolded some of the changes from the previous webinar on the screen. Based on our team's interactions with CACFP operators and their feedback, there were still some confusion on what it meant when we said ounce equivalents. While many people understood ounces as a measurement of weight, the equivalence portion was throwing people off. So we focused on providing an explanation that details out how different grain products can have varying amounts of grain ingredients. We also focused on what this change to ounce equivalents meant in practice. While the precision of ounce equivalents can sound intimidating, the actual difference in portion sizes served doesn't change very much. We wanted to focus on what this change meant on day-to-day operations, and the answer is that it does not have a big impact. Between the old serving sizes and the new ounce equivalent serving sizes, most portion sizes only changed by 2 to 10 grams in weight. In my webinar, I emphasized that because 2 to 10 grams was not a big practical difference in portion sizes, it generally would have very limited impact on what most operators were currently serving. This was where we were able to alleviate some concern about switching over to ounce equivalents. We explained the requirements, and this time we were able to provide Team Nutrition resources. We focused on 3 main resources and explained how to use them, how to make sure they were meeting minimum portion size requirements. Again, the focus was not on calculations and getting the right numbers, but whether they were meeting the portion sizes. And we had interactive polls throughout. The first resource we provided was a familiar one. This document is USDA's Exhibit A's grains requirements for child nutrition programs and is listed as number 4 on the webinar confirmation and reminder emails. We used this handout before in our previous ounce equivalent trainings and thought this would provide a good foundation for understanding ounce equivalents. This chart groups grains by similar types and helps CACFP operators understand the differences between current minimum serving sizes and ounce equivalent portions. The rightmost column provides the previous minimum serving sizes for each group, and the middle column provides the ounce equivalent serving sizes. The chart allows for comparison between the 2 systems. Using Exhibit A to determine ounce equivalent portion sizes does require some calculations though. CACFP operators have to understand how to convert ounce equivalents to grams or ounce weight and compare that to nutrition fact label serving sizes. It does provide a good foundation of understanding, but is probably not the resource that would be the easiest to use. And this is where the second resource we used came in, which was Team Nutrition's Using Ounce Equivalents for Grains in the CACFP, which is listed as number 6 on the confirmation and reminder emails. As I mentioned before, we knew that we had to pick just one Team Nutrition handout given the amount of time we had to train, and we ended up choosing this worksheet. The reason we chose this is because the tables under the grains measuring chart on pages 2 through 4 provides minimum ounce equivalent serving sizes for each age group for about 90% of common grains served. Besides the user-friendly design with the great graphics, the handout is the simplest way for CACFP operators to understand whether they are meeting portion size requirements or not. No calculations are required. For example, if you had a center that was serving mini hard pretzels, but they did not know if their portion sizes met minimum amount required for their after-school kids, you could refer them to the grains measuring chart on page 4 of this worksheet, and it will let you know if they were serving children ages 6 through 18. They would need at least 14 pretzels to meet the 1 ounce equivalents of grains required for that age group. ODE had a similar tool that was used for the oat serving sizes, and so this was instantly relatable to many of our CACFP operators and was incredibly helpful as they start to transition to using ounce equivalents. The last tool that we discussed in our live webinar was Exhibit A's Grains tool in the Electronic Food Buying Guide. This is listed as number 14 on the reminder and confirmation emails. While the Team Nutrition worksheets will cover most items, we wanted our CACFP operators to know where to find additional resources if they hit upon an item that was not in the worksheet. The added bonus was that the Food Buying Guide mobile app could also be downloaded and readily accessible. This could be useful for smaller centers or providers who like to check serving sizes and whether an item is creditable or not when they are out shopping for CACFP. Both the web browser version and the mobile app have search functions and the ability to modify portions, which may also be helpful. While we did not conduct any formal surveys after our last webinar, we did find that it was well received and seemed to help our CACFP operators start preparing for any changes that may be needed. From what we have heard, operators are relieved that the change to ounce equivalents will not have much effect on their day-to-day operations. You might have noticed that I didn't go into a lot of specific detail on our ounce equivalence trainings during this webinar, and that's because you can watch our full training. ODE has edited the recording and posted it on our YouTube channel, and this was made public in January of 2021. You can find it in the URL listed on the slide. It is also listed as resource number 18 on the confirmation and reminder emails. Our hope was that this could be a continuing resource for CACFP operators who are looking for an introduction to ounce equivalents in grains. We also plan to use this to train new ODE staff internally in the future, train new organizations that come on board to CACFP, and to provide this as a training for CACFP operators who require technical assistance in the future. From our live webinar and online video, we found that online trainings in general are much more convenient for most attendees since it allows for greater flexibility. Instead of taking time off from their busy days, staff can take an hour out of their day to learn valuable information about the CACFP meal pattern. Nowadays, most platforms have the ability to take questions through chat boxes, and polling options are often easy to set up if you want to engage with your audience. One of the greatest benefits of online training is that you can reach a much larger audience, like our webinar today. And it provides others who were not able to make the webinar a chance to view it in the future. From comparing our timelines between in-person and online trainings, You can see that there is much less staff time and resource commitments while still being able to convey the same information. There are still drawbacks though. Vibrant discussions are hard to moderate during a live webinar, and the ability for attendees to communicate with each other is also limited in scope. While many people have the technical proficiency to attend virtual trainings, there is still a hurdle to overcome, and having staff who can help troubleshoot technical problems may be necessary. Virtual trainings also mean that attendees do not have tangible handouts or items to take away from the training. Printed materials can be helpful for some operators, although Team Nutrition also has print materials that can be ordered. Finally, the main drawback is that this limits your ability to diversify trainings to a variety of training styles or learning styles. Those who require more hands-on learning may retain less information overall. So with all of those benefits and drawbacks of training on different platforms in mind, how would you like to train your staff or other CACFP operators on ounce equivalents for grains? And so the poll has been launched. Thank you. Keep in mind your current resources. If you have trainings in the near future, you may also have to think about limitations on travel as well. Do you plan to train in person, via online webinars, whether it's live or previously recorded, through online videos, or through another method altogether? And if you choose other, you can provide details in the chat box. We would love to see it. Okay, let me just give you a few more seconds to answer the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's see how you answered. And it looks like it's split almost half and half in between in-person and online webinars. So that's good to know. I mean, I'm surprised that in-person is so popular, and maybe it shouldn't be, since in-person trainings do provide you with more chances to have in-depth discussions and provides attendees with more opportunities to ask questions or to learn from other participants. So thank you all for sharing today. It's always great to see what other trainers are planning as well. Before I end today, I wanted to review a few takeaways from our experience with ounce equivalent training. First, use the Team Nutrition resources. There are quite a few resources, and they are all helpful in their own way. And depending on your audience, you may find one that works especially well for you. While you may find that having a wide variety of resources may help different audiences, you will want to curate and pick a select few to focus your trainings. I know Mimi will be telling us more about Team Nutrition's resources for grains ounce equivalents in just a few seconds. Also, audience feedback is always helpful. In-person training allows you to feel that energy in the room, and you tend to get richer feedback when surveys are turned in the day of the training, but all surveys are helpful in determining what works and what didn't work. This helps you to adapt to your audience's needs. When it comes to ounce equivalents for grains, make the transition as simple as possible by demystifying ounce equivalents. You can do this by explaining its purpose and what the change will actually mean to them on a day-to-day level. Walk your audience through an example and then empower them to try out additional examples with the resources that you provide. And as we saw from our poll, different formats work for different people. Find the one that works best for your audience. They all have benefits and drawbacks, but all of them can be successful. So thank you everyone for taking a stroll through our ounce equivalents training with me. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box now, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of today's webinar. If you have additional questions and you would like to ask me post-webinar, feel free to email me at shirley.wu@state.or.us.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for your wonderful presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Mimi Wu, and as Katie mentioned, I am with USDA's Child Nutrition Programs in the Nutrition, Education, Training, and Technical Assistance Division. So my part of the webinar today will focus on Team Nutrition's training tools for implementing grains ounce equivalents in the CACFP. I know Shirley mentioned a few of our resources that they use for their trainings in Oregon. So my part of the presentation will give you some more information on those resources, as well as introduce you to some of Team Nutrition's other tools for implementing grains ounce equivalents. Every resource I'm going to talk about today can be found on Team Nutrition's new CACFP Grains Ounce Equivalents Resources webpage. The web address is shown on the bottom of the screen. The web address is also listed as number 5 on the confirmation and reminder emails, and is also in the chat box on the bottom or side of your screen. So let's start with Team Nutrition's Using Ounce Equivalents for Grains in the CACFP Training Worksheet. This worksheet is listed as number 6 on the webinar emails and is available in English and in Spanish, online and in print. This is the Team Nutrition worksheet that the Oregon Department of Education used in their trainings. So this worksheet includes a grains measuring chart with over 40 grain items that are commonly served in the CACFP. This chart tells you how much of that item you need to serve based on the age of your participants and the meal or snack you are serving. Grain items are listed alphabetically on the left column of each page, and this is outlined in orange on your screen. The chart also shows the amount of a grain you need to make up a ½ ounce equivalent, which is the minimum amount of grains required for 1 through 5-year-olds at all CACFP meals and snacks. This column is outlined on your screen with dashed green lines. This chart also shows the amount of an item you need to make up 1 ounce equivalent, which is the minimum amount of grains required for 6 through 18-year-olds at all CACFP meals and snacks. When serving grains at snacks to adult participants, you must also serve at least 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So this is the column that is outlined in orange on your screen. The column outlined with purple squares shows the amount of a grain item needed for 2 ounce equivalent of grains, which is the minimum amount required for adult participants at breakfast, lunch, and supper. So now, as I mentioned, this chart has over 40 grain items that might be commonly served in the CACFP. We try to be as inclusive as possible, but there was no way we were going to be able to include every grain item that might ever be served in the CACFP. So later, we will talk more about other tools you can use if you want to serve an item that is not listed on this chart. The chart is meant to be grab and go so that someone can pick it up and just start using it. However, for those who like a bit more instruction, page 1 includes step-by-step directions on how to use this chart. For some items on this chart, all you need to do is find the item under grain, item, and size, and then find the age group and meal column you are serving. Where the row for the item and column for age group and meal meet, that tells you how much of the item you need to serve to meet minimum amounts of grains required in the CACFP. So, for example, if you want to serve popcorn to children 6 through 18 years old at any meal or snack, you would first find the popcorn row, and then second, find the 6 through 18-year-olds column. Where the popcorn row and the 6 through 18-year-old column meets, you see that you need to serve at least 3 cups of popcorn to meet the minimum amount of grains required. So other items on the chart may have sizes listed next to it, like the hard pretzels you see on the screen. The measurements 1 1/4 inch by 1 1/2 inch is written in parentheses below the name. If the item you want to serve has measurements next to or below the name, you will need to see if the item is that size or larger. You could use a ruler to do this, or you could use the ruler that's included as part of the grains measuring guide on page 6 of this worksheet. So here you can see that we measure the pretzel across to make sure that it is 1.5 inches long across. And we also rotated the pretzel to show that it's 1.5 inches tall. So now we know that this pretzel measures 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. This is larger than the 1 1/4 by 1.5 inches required in the grains measuring chart. Now that we've made sure this pretzel is at least the same size as the one on the grains measuring chart, we can use the chart to see how many of these pretzels to serve. So when we go back to our grains measuring chart, first we find the pretzel row, and then second, find the column for the age and meal we want to serve. So now let's say we want to serve this pretzel to 10-year-olds at snack. This chart shows us that we would need to serve at least 14 pretzels to meet the minimum amount of grains required at snack for 10-year-olds in the CACFP. In addition to grains with measurements, the grains measuring chart also includes grains that have a weight written by the name of the item. So one example, as you see on the slide, is pita bread or pita rounds, which has at least 56 grams written below the name of the item. When we have an item with a weight written next to or below the name, we need to make sure our item weighs that amount or more. So in this example, if we do want to serve pita rounds, the grains measuring chart tells us that the pita round has to weigh at least 56 grams. So with that in mind, let's pretend we want to serve brand P pita rounds. The nutrition facts label for brand P pita rounds is shown on the right side of the slide. So this nutrition facts label tells us that one brand P pita round weighs 57 grams. 57 grams is more than 56 grams, so we know that we can use the chart to figure out how much of this brand P pita bread to serve. And here, our grains measuring chart shows us that if we do want to serve this brand P pita round to 4-year-olds at lunch, we need to serve at least 1/4 of this pita round. I know I just flew through that super quickly, and that's because if you want to learn more, you can actually find a 30-minute webinar recording that focuses specifically on how to use this worksheet and includes practice questions so you can test your knowledge. These recordings are listed as number 7 on your webinar email. We do also have a set of presentation slides with notes that you can download and use to conduct trainings on how to use this worksheet. Those presentation slides are listed as number 8 on the webinar email. Both of these resources are available in English and in Spanish. So another team nutrition training worksheet that includes a grains measuring chart is our crediting single serving packages of grains in the CACFP. This webinar is listed as number 9 in your webinar emails. As the title implies, this worksheet focuses on single serving packages of grain items, such as bags of crackers, bowls or individual boxes of cereal, or individually wrapped muffins. This worksheet shows operators how many packages of the item they might need to serve to meet minimum requirements for grains in a reimbursable CACFP meal or snack. Team Nutrition recently held a 30-minute CACFP halftime 30 on Thursdays training webinar that focused on how to use this worksheet. This webinar was, again, conducted in English and in Spanish. The recording of this webinar can be found on the CACFP halftime page, and the web address for that page is listed as number 10 on your webinar emails. So for both of the worksheets we've shown so far, they have focused on meeting grains ounce equivalents for child and adult participants in the CACFP. Team Nutrition also has a worksheet that focuses on using grains ounce equivalents in the CACFP infant meal pattern. This worksheet is appropriately titled Feeding Infants Using Ounce Equivalents for Grains in the CACFP. This worksheet is listed as number 11 on your webinar emails. So on the first page of this worksheet, you'll see the types of grains allowed at meals and snacks for infants in the CACFP. At breakfast, lunch, and supper, the only grain that can be credited toward those reimbursable meals is iron-fortified infant cereal. Grains are not required at infant meals, so if you do serve grains, iron-fortified infant cereal is the only grain that can be counted. At snack, grains are required once the infant is developmentally ready to accept them. The only types of grains allowed as part of a reimbursable snack for infants are bread-like items, crackers, iron-fortified infant cereal, and ready-to-eat cereal. So now, let's take a closer look at the charts for each grain item in the worksheet. The chart for bread-like items, and iron-fortified infant cereal is shown on the left side of the screen. This chart is also shown on page 3 of this worksheet. First, let's look at iron-fortified infant cereal. Again, iron-fortified infant cereal is the only grain that can be credited toward a reimbursable infant breakfast, lunch, or supper. So currently, the minimum amount of iron-fortified infant cereal to serve once the infant has been eating the iron-fortified infant cereal regularly is 4 tablespoons. When we use ounce equivalents, the minimum amount of iron-fortified infant cereal required will still be 4 tablespoons. So as a reminder, again, iron-fortified infant cereal is optional infant breakfast, lunch, and supper. So this means you can serve less than 4 tablespoons of iron-fortified infant cereal if you serve it with meat, fish, poultry, eggs, cheese, cooked peas or beans once the infant is developmentally ready to accept them. And of course, you don't have to serve iron-fortified infant cereal at all at breakfast, lunch, or supper. You can serve just meat, fish, cheese, etc. instead. At snack for infants, grains are required once the infant is ready to accept them. In addition to iron-fortified infant cereal, you may, again, serve bread-like items, crackers, or ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. For many of these grain items, the amount to serve once the infant is regularly eating that food remains the same. So for example, right now, one option for grains at snack for an infant is a half slice of bread. When we use ounce equivalents, the requirement is still a half slice of bread. If you want to serve crackers, the current requirement at snack is 2 crackers once the infant is regularly eating them. When we use ounce equivalents, depending on the size of the cracker, this requirement might still be 2 crackers. If you're serving smaller crackers, then you may need to serve more than 2 crackers. If you're serving larger crackers, you may need to serve only half or 1 cracker. For ready-to-eat breakfast cereals, if you're serving flakes or rounds, you're serving the same amount, so 4 tablespoons, in order to meet minimum requirements when using grains ounce equivalents. If you're serving puff cereal, you might need to serve a little bit more, 5 tablespoons instead of 4 tablespoons when using grains ounce equivalents. So just like the grains measuring chart we talked about for children and adults in other worksheets, some items in the charts in this infant worksheet do have a weight listed next to or under the name, such as at least 28 grams for the bread, biscuits, bun. So you will need to make sure your item weighs that amount or more in order to use this worksheet. Other items in the grains measuring chart for infants may have measurements written next to it, such as about 2 inches by 2 inches for saltine. Again, you'd have to make sure your items are the same size or larger than those dimensions in order to use this worksheet. And just like the worksheet for children and adults, this worksheet for infants also includes a grains measuring guide with a ruler. You can find this on page 6 of the infant worksheet. So now, switching gears from infants, for CACFP operators who like to serve homemade grain items prepared from scratch, Teen Nutrition created a worksheet to help them determine the amount of grains ounce equivalents in one portion of the recipe. This worksheet is shown on the screen in front of you and is titled Determining Ounce Equivalents of Grains in CACFP Recipes. The worksheet is listed as number 13 on the webinar emails. So in this worksheet, you would look at the amount of grain ingredients in your recipe, convert them to grams, and divide by the number of portions to determine the amount of grains ounce equivalents in each portion. This worksheet includes detailed instructions on how to fill out this worksheet, as well as sample questions that can be used to help reinforce knowledge. So finally, our last worksheet today is titled Calculating Ounce Equivalents for Grains in the CACFP. This worksheet can be used for items that are smaller or weigh less than the items listed in the grains measuring chart. This worksheet may also come in handy when you want to serve a less common amount of grains, such as a 1/4 ounce equivalent or 3/4 ounce equivalent of grains. This worksheet does include some calculations, which we know some operators actually love and others actively avoid. So as a reminder, all of the resources I'm talking about today are optional and not required. This worksheet starts out by asking you to find the age group of your participants, as well as the meal or snack you want to serve. You can then use this information to determine the minimum amount of grains required. So let's pretend we want to serve saltine crackers to 4-year-olds at lunch. This chart shows you that you need to serve enough saltines to make up a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains. And this is because the minimum amount of grains required for children ages 1 through 5 years old at CACFP meals and snacks is a 1/2 ounce equivalent. This worksheet then directs you to find the item in the grains ounce equivalence chart on pages 4 and 5 to see how much of the food you need to serve. So remember that for our example, we need to serve a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains, and the grains we want to serve are saltines, which are a type of savory cracker. So this chart tells us that a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains is equal to 11 grams of savory crackers. In other words, this means that you need to serve each 4-year-old at least 11 grams of saltine crackers to meet the minimum required amount of grains at lunch. The worksheet will then show you how to use the information on the nutrition facts label to see the amount of the foods you need to serve to meet that minimum weight. So again, using our example of saltines at lunch for 4-year-olds, remember that we need to serve each child a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains, and that a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains equals 11 grams of saltines. So now this part of the worksheet would show you how to use the information on the Crackers Nutrition Facts label to see how many saltines there are in 11 grams. If all of this sounds overwhelming or really complicated, just remember again that using this worksheet is optional and not required. We know that some learners learn best by doing, so this worksheet is meant for those who prefer to see the calculations that go into determining grains ounce equivalents. For those who don't need to see those behind-the-scenes calculations, the Food Buying Guide's Exhibit A Grains tool will calculate the amount of a grain item to serve. This tool is useful for those who want to use their phones or computers to determine how much of a grain item to serve, and is listed as number 14 on the webinar emails. As Shirley mentioned, the Oregon Department of Education also used this tool in their training. And to use this resource, the operator looks at the item's nutrition facts label and enters the serving size and weight into the tool. The tool will then calculate how much of that grain item they need to serve in order to meet minimum requirements. There are also built-in guides and tutorials that walk users through the process step by step. Team Nutrition also has 2 recorded webinars that guide users on how to use this Exhibit A Grains tool, and those webinars are listed as number 15 and 16 on the webinar email. So that concludes my portion of the webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Katie for wrap-up and questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time and attention today.
All right. Thank you, Mimi, and great job, Shirley and Mimi. So we have a couple minutes. I'm going to hopefully be able to ask you each one question. But before I do that, remember CACFP operators are required to start using ounce equivalents for grains in the CACFP starting on October 1st of this year, so 2021. Team Nutrition has provided a vast array of resources that you just heard about to help operators make the transition. And many states have also developed training tools for their program operators. Since we are less than 8 months away from the required implementation date,
Now is really the time for CACFP operators to learn about ounce equivalents for grains and to get ready for that transition. So like I said, we'll take questions in just a minute, so go ahead and type them into the chat box if you haven't already done that, and we will take them in just a second. Before I take them, Team Nutrition, I want to mention that Team Nutrition is working on making printed versions of the Team Nutrition grains ounce equivalent training worksheets available to order for free for CACFP operators, sponsoring organizations, and state agencies, and we will send an announcement to all registered attendees once those are available to order. Additionally, whether or not you are using our resources, USDA would love to hear how your grains ounce equivalence trainings are going, so please, please, please feel free to email us at teamnutrition@usda.gov with your success stories or suggestions of other training tools that you might find helpful. And finally, Team Nutrition will be sending out certificates of participation to those who attend this entire webinar. You should receive these certificates no later than February 24th, and please wait until after February 24th and check your spam or junk mailboxes before reaching out to Team Nutrition about the status of your certificate. You can also visit the National CACFP Sponsors Association website at the link on your screen if you want to try some practice questions about grains ounce equivalents or track your continuing education credits. This link is not included in your confirmation or reminder emails, but we will definitely send it to you all tomorrow as part of the post-webinar email that is going out to everyone who registered for this webinar. With that, I want to say thank you, and we're going to take a couple questions. I know we're at time. So this one is for you, Mimi, real quick. Can USDA provide a list of products with brands and tell us how much to serve to meet grains ounce equivalent requirements?
So great question. USDA does not provide lists of branded products. However, we know that many sponsoring organizations have created lists of branded items available in their area and how much to serve to meet grains ounce equivalence requirements. So you might want to check with your sponsor to see if they might have more information or resources.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mimi. And Shirley, we will wrap up with you here. It looks like this one would be appropriate for you. So it says, Shirley, what are some things you found helpful in relaying to attendees that you felt made them more comfortable with implementing ounce equivalents for grains?
Yeah, great question. I mentioned a few things, but essentially we found that emphasizing what the actual change meant in terms of day-to-day operations helped. I had mentioned how we discussed in our August 2020 ODE webinar how most portion sizes only changed from 2 to 10 grams. So it's not a big difference in actual portion sizes served. Also that most attendees seem to already be familiar with ounce equivalents for the meat and meat alternate component. So we were able to draw that comparison there. And of course, we found that providing Team Nutrition resources and discussing how to use those resources was very helpful as well.
Great. Thank you all for your great questions. And I'm sorry we're a bit over time. If you have more questions though, and you need more clarification on anything we discussed today, please contact your state agency or sponsoring organization. And that is all the time we have for today, but please know that we do read all of your questions and comments, as well as the comments in the post-webinar survey in order to make sure our materials meet your needs. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.